Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, with a presentation looking at a wall, the Berlin Wall. Appropriate, I think, for a bricklayer's son, which I am. Now you can see from the potential questions on this slide that you first need to know just what the wall was, and I think I'll cover that for you. But also why it was built and what were the reactions to it. And again, I think I do a good job on that for you too. So let's get on with it. The building of the Berlin Wall in 1961 is wedged in between the crises in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. It was very different in nature, though it was the result of deep dissatisfaction amongst Berliners and the people of the German Democratic Republic generally, so it did share important similarities too. Disillusioned and disaffected with communism, with its oppression and low standard of living, Berliners and others from elsewhere in the GDR were fleeing communism for a new life in the West. Of course, East Berliners would cross fairly easily into West Berlin and had a ready comparison to make with life in the two halves of the city. In West Berlin, people were free and shops were full of a wide variety of goods. Its cafes, bars, restaurants and nightclubs and its cinemas made it a fun place to be. And West Germany as a whole had undergone an economic miracle. Trade and prosperity had returned to Germans, West Germans at least, whereas in the GDR, under a command economy and with a quarter of industrial output still going to the Soviet Union, consumer goods were in short supply. Wages were kept low in any case, and there were still food shortages, and housing was poor. And just as it was fairly easy to move around Berlin, it was relatively easy to migrate to the west. With free access into West Berlin, from there the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, was within reach. Well over 2 million people had done so by 1961. Not only were the numbers staggering, they were unsustainable. The numbers were particularly high amongst the young and amongst the highly skilled workers and well-qualified engineers and technocrats, as well as the professional class, if we can use that word here, teachers, lawyers and doctors. The very people who were needed to build a bright future for the GDR. It was what we call a brain drain, but it was also raising the average age of the East German population, which would eventually become a burden on the state and its workers. And it just made the communist system appear to be second best. People were literally voting with their feet and fleeing to the West. Now in 1961, America had a new president, young and inexperienced, John F. Kennedy. President Khrushchev of the Soviet Union thought this was a man he could dominate and chose Berlin to make his mark. Kennedy and Khrushchev held a summit meeting in Vienna in June 1961. Kennedy, having only just overseen the fiasco that was the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in April, was in a particularly weak position. Khrushchev still wanted American troops to withdraw from West Berlin and threatened to cut off the communication links with West Germany, just as Stalin had done in 1948. With American troops out of Berlin, it would be a lot easier to keep East Germans in. After the summit, which reached no agreement, Khrushchev issued a 6-month deadline for American withdrawal. Kennedy, however, stood firm. So, in the early hours of August the 13th, 1961, a Sunday, police sealed off most of the crossing points in Berlin with barbed wire barriers, and soldiers of the GDR hastily erected a barbed wire fence encircling West Berlin, in so doing ending all free movement between East and West Berlin, though not closing the West's access to the city. There would be no movement under the city either. The underground railway system was closed and sewers were blocked. The fence soon began to be replaced by a brick wall and was eventually guarded with 300 watchtowers and a wide barren strip on its eastern side as buildings near the wall were demolished. In places, this strip was mined. The Berlin Wall quickly came to symbolize a divided Europe, divided not by an iron curtain, but by a brick one. It also became a symbol of communist tyranny. For Berliners, it meant that overnight free access from East to West Berlin ended. Families were divided. People were no longer able to access goods in the West. Some people were no longer able to go to work. But there was no interference with the links between West Berlin and West Germany. There were still attempts to escape to the West, and more than 100 deaths resulted from these attempts. For the Soviet Union, it was a humiliation, but a necessary one. They referred to the wall as the anti-fascist defense wall. They claimed that they had only acted to prevent spies from operating in East Berlin, but nobody accepted that. Everybody knew that they had built a wall not to keep an enemy out, but to keep their own people from fleeing. But they had to stop the hemorrhaging of their best people. The Western response took the form of a war of words. They were never going to go to war over the wall. The Soviet Union was accused of violating East-West agreements, of a breach of international law, as it went against the four-power status of Berlin. However, only if the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin again, or else invaded it, would the West contemplate a military response. President Kennedy concluded that a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war. But it was a propaganda coup. President Kennedy visited West Berlin in June 1963, and in a speech that became famous, invited anyone who didn't understand the issue between the free world and communism to come to Berlin and see for themselves. He declared himself a Berliner, Ich bin ein Berliner, saying that everyone in the West was now a Berliner. Unfortunately or not, because it was fun and it created a mini industry in Berlin, he actually got the German phrase wrong, and instead of saying, I am a Berliner, said, I am a donut. But it didn't matter. Berliners loved him, both for what he said and for what he meant to say. So, I began with potential questions, and I'll end with more questions. These are about reactions, consequences, and the significance of all the three crises you have studied. I do hope this presentation has been useful for you and that your studies are going well. Don't forget my other stuff, the ebooks and my website. But as always, I do thank you for listening. Cheers.